Hello everyone and welcome to the Oxford Policy Pod. I'm Isabella Notarpietro and today I'm here with fellow MPP student Diego Peñaranda, and we're very excited to be interviewing our guest for today, Professor Anandi Mani.
Thank you for having me.
She is Professor of Behavioral Economics and Public Policy and happens to be our wonderful academic supervisor here at the Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford. Her research lies in development economics with a specific focus on the behavioral economics of poverty, social exclusion, gender, and public good provision. Anandi, thank you very much.
Lovely to be here.
So we've just heard a bit about your bio, but it would be great to hear, to start in your own words, about your personal and professional journey to the Blavatnik School of Government.
Sure, I can see a little bit. As you might guess from my accent, I am Indian. And I grew up in Mumbai, the maximum city, as it's called. And I went to the US for my graduate school. I have to say that as an undergraduate or a graduate for that matter, until I went to the PhD, I had not studied economics formally, very, very little, maybe one introductory level course. But as things turned out, I did switch to economics and did my PhD at Boston University. And I worked for a little while after that in the US. My first job was at Vanderbilt University. But like many academics, I also happened to have an academic spouse, and we had a joint location issue. And that's how we decided to, give it a shot and move to the UK. So I was first at Warwick. And then after a stint at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Study, I moved here to Oxford. And then I have been at the Blavatnik School ever since.
Mhm. And we're grateful that you're in the Blavatnik School. Here you were our professor in economics, but you also teach behavioral economics. So could you explain for our audience what behavioral economics is and how it's different from, say, more traditional economics?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I did not do economics as an undergraduate. And like I have said sometimes in the classroom, I think I didn't fully drink the rational choice Kool-Aid, because I came to it maybe a bit later in life, unlike many of my PhD level classmates. But briefly about the distinction between the two, economics is called the science of scarcity, as you know from our econ course. But in a way, it was terribly ironic to me that it assumes scarcity in everything. So scarcity of money, scarcity of time, scarcity of material resources, but not scarcity in terms of our human mental bandwidth, right? So rational choice basically assumes that we have infinite mental capacity, and therefore we make decisions which are very carefully calibrated, that we can take all the information available at hand, really process it very efficiently. And so we have a very clear and stable preferences about what we want, and we know very clearly what we want. And so then we make these optimal decisions. So we never overeat, we never overspend, right? And so we're never late to things, and emotions don't cloud our judgment, right? So that's sort of a rational choice framework, right? And on the other hand, behavioral economics adds to all of these other dimensions of scarcity. Importantly, scarcity also in our mental resources, right? Our ability to assimilate, use information, make judgments, etc. And so that's the broad distinction between the two. And the reason that we still have a discipline as behavioral economics, unlike the old line from Anna Karenina, which would say every happy family is happy in the same way, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its different ways. Behavioral economics exists as a discipline because there has been a body of work which says that even though we sort of deviate from what the rational choice framework would predict, we are in many ways predictably irrational, right? So there are systematic ways in which we seem to deviate. So there's a body of work both with a conceptual framework, but then also a lot of empirical evidence and many studies to back that. And that is what makes it a discipline, because otherwise we would just have to throw our hands up and not be able to say anything systematic or meaningful. It's that there is that distinction between the two. But I still think that both aspects of it are true in the way we behave. And so it is useful to use both frameworks.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. It would be really helpful just for our audience if you could go into a few examples, for example, of the ways that people predictably deviate from this kind of Homo economicus, rational man theory of economics.
Sure, right? So let's take a simple example, right? So let's say that, you normally, you know, would not think twice about taking a plane, right? But, that morning in the newspaper, you read about this big, air crash, right? So then this kind of makes you very wary about taking a plane, and you say, oh, maybe I will take a train instead, right? Now, I don't know the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but, the data would show, for instance, that car accidents, right, are much more frequent. Many more people die in car accidents, right? So you might say, oh, I'll take the car instead rather than take a plane to go somewhere. But in fact, that's because of what we would call the availability heuristic, right? So suddenly, when you're making this decision about whether to take a plane or whether to take a car, you read this and it colors your judgment because that's something which is kind of top of mind for you. It's easily available, that piece of information. And so that distorts your decision in the moment, right? So that's called an availability heuristic, right? And there are lots of other heuristics like this. A heuristic, by the way, is just sort of a mental shortcut, shall I say, or a rule of thumb about how I should make a decision. And that's just because we have so many things that we need to choose or decide during the day, using these mental shortcuts is just a way to simplify our life, right? And many times they do work, right? But sometimes they do fall short, right? So, for example, when I grew up in Mumbai, right, if you saw a clear sky, right, and it was sunny, right, then the presumption was that it's going to be a very hot day, right? Except that when I moved to graduate school and I lived in Boston, right? When I looked out, if it was January and I looked out and it was a very sunny and clear day, and I would say, okay, today I can get away with a light jacket. Turned out it was the opposite,
It's freezing.
and it took me a little while to learn that. So I had this mental shortcut, clear sky, clear sunny sky equal to hot day, right? But it turned out that there was that shortcut had its, it worked as long as I was, in my Mumbai world, right? But when I moved to a world which was different, right, it didn't work, right? So mental shortcuts are useful, right? And that's why we develop them. But then there are ways in which they also do sometimes break down.
Thank you. I really find behavioral economics fascinating. And now I want to turn to the relationship between behavioral economics and the poverty. So you had a paper that was cited, I think, more than 4,000 times with Eldar Shafir and other colleagues. He also came to teach us at Oxford, called Poverty Impedes Cognitive Function. So I want to dig a bit more into this intersection of psychological factors and poverty. Could you tell us a bit more about that research and elaborate on how poverty affects the way people think and make their decisions?
Yeah. So just to give you a little bit of background in this, right? I am primarily a development economist. So what brought me into economics as when I switched out of accounting was because I grew up in this world where you see, on a daily basis, taking the public transport in Mumbai or wherever you are, you see there is this very stark juxtaposition between people who are very rich and people who are quite poor, living cheek by jowl with each other. And there has been a lot of systematic evidence also, as well, quite apart from what I have sort of casually experienced growing up, that poor people are often tardy in the way they, for example, don't keep up appointments, or they have fewer conversations with their children. They don't monitor how much TV they watch. They don't take their kids to get vaccinated, even if the vaccines are known to be perfectly safe and they are fully free. A lot of these kinds of things, right? And so I think maybe more so in developed countries, for sure, but also to some extent, given the experiences I have had in India, sometimes you get the feeling that, why do they behave in these ways, right? It doesn't cost money to talk to your kids nicely or to, monitor whether they're doing their homework, for instance, right? You can get kids to wash their hands before eating. Why don't they do it? These sorts of things, right? And so there is this whole narrative that somehow these people can't get their act together, and that is what then keeps them poor, right? And I think that um, as a starting point, hard as it is, we have to sort of acknowledge that, yes, even in our own personal experiences, we do sometimes find the behaviors that they engage in somewhat baffling, right? But the uh, pause that we did, and sort of, the break we took in this, is to think in terms of, sure, we take, we acknowledge that there are these behaviors, but the question is, which way is the causality going? What do I mean by that? So is it that some people are making poor choices and that is keeping them poor, right? So in other words, it would be their decisions which is keeping them poor. So that's the direction of the causality. Or is it that there is something about the context or the situation or the circumstances of being poor that causes people to make these poor choices, right? And whether it's one way or the other, so whether it's the poverty causing bad choices or whether it's bad choices causing poverty, that changes a lot of things. It changes how you think about the problem. It changes how you interpret the behaviors that you see. And that is the backdrop, sort of to the work that we undertook. Because, until then in development economics, for example, there had been papers which look at like short-term loans that poor people take, right? Which they take at very high interest rates. And then people do these sort of calculations about what it must imply about their degree of impatience, what we call how much they discount the future, as we would call it, right? And the implied rates of impatience were like really high, right? And somehow it didn't add up. It didn't make sense, to think it sounded too high for people to be that impatient. And so I think just a steady adding up of different pieces of evidence made both development economists, but also, people working in other countries question some of the interpretation of the behavior. And so that's what led us to look at this question of, could there be something about the context or the situation of poverty that is causing certain types of behaviors? And so to understand that, we undertook this project where we actually did it in two countries in very different settings. And so that was more, to show that to the extent that there is poverty both in poor and in rich countries, that, is there some commonality about the situation of being poor? So in the US, would you like me to say a little more
Absolutely,
about
please, of course.
yeah,
Yeah.
about the content of the research itself? Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Yeah.
So in the US, we were we did this in Princeton in a mall actually, where there were shoppers. And basically what we did was, to all the people who agreed to participate in the study, we presented them some scenarios which were financially challenging, right? So we said, what if you have a car problem, right? Your car breaks down and you have to fix it. Like, what would you do, right? And to some people, so we kind of split them randomly into two groups. And to some people, we made it an easy problem. So it's like a $150 problem that you have to fix, right? And and the other half, it was a hard problem. It was like a $1,500 problem, right? And then while they're thinking about how they will deal with that situation, will they just keep driving and think the problem will go away? Will they excuse me, will they get a loan from somebody, or will they, how will they fix it, right? What will they do? And while they're thinking about it, we made them do some IQ tests. So these are sort of standard tests. They've been used in lots of different types of studies. And so it's very comparable in terms of magnitudes for interpretation. And basically what we found there was that if it's a $150 problem, whether it's a person who's relatively poorer or richer, they do just about the same on the IQ tests. But what changes dramatically is when we make it a much harder financial problem. And then that's where the gap really opens up. So the people who are relatively better off continue to do about the same, but the people who are poorer, that's when their performance on the IQ tests really drop off, right? So that was our way of testing this hypothesis that when I worry about money, right, when I have worries about money on my head, how does that then affect my ability to focus, pay attention to a task in front of me and do it well, right? And therefore, the sort of the underlying hypothesis in terms of this direction of causality is that when I'm juggling incomes which are low, which are uncertain, I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills or make ends meet, and I'm having to do that continually, right? It just takes up so much of my headspace, of my mental bandwidth, that even for things I know are important, whether it's about talking to my kids, looking at whether they're doing their homework, making sure they wash their hands before having dinner, all these things which don't cost money, but I just don't have the mental space to pay attention to it at the right time, right? So whatever I have is consumed by things which are urgent, and that means something gets sacrificed, and that is the stuff which is important, but it's just not in front of my face at this moment, right? So that's a study that we did in the US, and in a very different setting, and this was in India, in South India. And unlike in the US, where we were sort of giving people hypothetical scenarios and, getting them, we were not affecting how much money they had, but we were affecting the worries, with a hypothetical scenario. In India, the worries were sort of naturally there in the environment. What do I mean by that? We were working with a bunch of sugarcane farmers where it's a very long crop cycle. And so what happens is the sugarcane farmer, at the beginning of this 11-month cycle, they plant the sugarcane, and they do that by taking loans from the sugar mill, for instance, to buy the inputs, etc. And so when it's almost 11 months' time, when it's time to harvest, by that time, they are really financially down to the wire. Right? Because, they're waiting for their whole annual income to materialize. That will happen when the sugar mill chooses to cut their crop. But until then, they don't have much. They often are pawning their wife's jewelry. All of that is happening. They're very tight. And so the same sugarcane farmer, a few weeks before harvest, the person who is very poor, a few weeks after, when he or she has got their money, they are significantly better off than they were before, right? So we tried to use this very naturally occurring variation by looking at the same person, before harvest versus after. And we did collect some additional, data on what they were eating, what the other sort of demands were on them at that time. And so then we are sort of able to look at, because we're looking within person. So it's not like we're comparing rich versus poor people like we did in the US. We're looking at the same person. And then we're able to sort of capture much better in a quantified way what is the impact on their IQ test performance, the same type of IQ tests, by just the contextual factors, right? By the situation, a few weeks before harvest being very poor versus a few weeks after being much better off. And we found very similar results in both settings. An IQ test drop of about 13 points, which comparing, benchmarking with other studies is like saying you go from the age of 45 to 60 overnight. That's how big an impact it is. And this is for the same person. So that was our way of sort of opening up this conversation of could there be something contextual about the conditions of poverty, which then sort of constrains people's mental resources and makes them prioritize urgent decisions, which they're continually firefighting over things which even they know are important, but then don't have enough bandwidth to do.
Super interesting. Obviously, we're here at the School of Government.
Yes.
So if we think about what the implication of this change in the direction of causality has for public policy, and if we're thinking specifically about poverty alleviation policies and programs, how does that research feed into how we're thinking about kind of policy design, program design?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a super important question. So I think that the sort of the broad overarching thing I would say is that when we design a policy, right, we want to keep in mind what is the amount of headspace that person has to absorb all that information. So, for example, we might say that, oh, people know about all these programs, right? They're eligible for all this. Surely they should be able to absorb all the information. They should be able to look it up in the right place and apply and get the benefits. So, for example, right, when it comes to financial aid for college, right, it turns out that a lot of poor people don't even apply for financial aid. And the normal reaction with somebody like you and I who, don't think this is a big deal is to say, hey, if they don't have money, somebody is giving financial aid to their children, surely they should be, right on top of it and should be able to fill in all the forms and take advantage of those opportunities, right? Turns out it didn't happen. And there was this lovely study by a bunch of Phil Oreopoulos and a bunch of co-authors which found that just helping people fill in the forms, right, increase the application rates for college by 38%. Right. And then people actually enrolled more. Right. So when we design the programs, we assume that people have all the, especially when it's in their interest, that they automatically will apply if they know that they're eligible. And all we need to do is to make those programs available. Right. But that doesn't happen because people are bandwidth challenged. Right. So making it easier for them to apply, right? Thinking about what are ways, rather than just put the information out and make programs available, how do I make it easier for them to access? It's sort of thinking about that in the minutest detail. In terms of what does it take at the level of implementation is something which can be really powerful. There was another study, for example, in Morocco, which looked at, providing piped water to people at home, right? And it turned out again that, if you said you had to come to an office somewhere and, fill in the forms and submit it, and you're somebody who's trying to, hold two jobs and hold your life together, turns out you don't apply, right? So how can we think about what are all the barriers that could happen? In psychology, they call these channel factors, right? What are all the barriers that people might encounter, right? Some of it may be because of things like that they are not educated, so filling in a form is harder, so that becomes a barrier. Some of it could be in terms of, I don't know, like depending on where you live, right? You don't have transport, right? So then I don't have a car, so I can't go to an office. Like in the US, for example, when I lived in Princeton, I was struck by how even to go to the grocery store, I actually ended up buying a car for the year, even though I wasn't planning to. I was there just for the year, because I found that if I wanted to do a proper grocery shopping, I needed a car. And it was getting so thinking about all these barriers in a systematic way, right? And trying to think about how can we make those channel factors and overcome them for poor people for whom these are multiple, is something to think about. And I think that there are a lot of also structural factors. So, for example, there are fewer grocery stores, there are fewer bank branches in areas that are poorer, right? And we don't account for that, right? So these structural things also compound and increase the barriers, but thinking about them in the design and thinking about ways in which we can make those things easier. So, for example, one of my collaborators did a big study in Brazil where they found that just having an app where a parent gets a text reminder, right? Very simple text reminder. Have you talked to your kids about school today? Right? And doing that for poorer kids made a big difference in terms of how many of them went to school regularly, in terms of attendance at school, and also in terms of grades and performance, right? So thinking about, when a parent has 20 things going on in their head, that reminder sends, it's a moment, and then the kid also gets a signal that my parent cares, that this is something important, and it changes outcomes. It will not change it for everyone, but on the margin, it can make a difference.
And so it sounds a bit like this dynamic of limited cognitive capacity isn't isn't specific only to people who are marginalized or living in poverty, right? There are other circumstances in which this can
Absolutely.
happen.
Yeah. So, I think that the book Scarcity, which Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafi wrote together, right? In a way, they sort of talk about, and it's you and I can feel it, right, on a regular basis when we have a deadline, right? So that is our equivalent of having a instead of financial scarcity, it's time scarcity, right? Because you're up against a hard deadline, right? And then you see how you behave, right? You eat more of crisps, you don't have a you don't have a proper meal, right? You don't go to the gym, right? When you're against exam deadlines, you've done the MPP, and I know how intensive a program it is.
Yeah.
And so when we have time scarcity, we do many of these things which we know are suboptimal from our longer term perspective, but we do it anyway, right? The big difference, though, is that unlike people who are in poverty, right, where these fires and the equivalent of these deadlines are happening much more often, right? And so it's the ubiquity of these sort of conditions that it's not a one-time thing, right? If I have a deadline, or if I have to have a conference or a presentation, I can hire a nanny, right? If somebody is not there, I can, I have more resources to. So I think it's how difficult when you don't have money, it sort of affects everything else much more. Absolutely, other people have these deadlines, and we do suffer from them. They're just not as chronic as what poorer people face, and that's what makes it so much harder.
Sorry, let me ask one more.
Yeah.
You've also written about the best ways to structure cash transfer programs.
Yeah.
Specifically related to seasonality, for example. So what's the role of that and time in policies?
So, I mean, again, going back to the core of the hypothesis, right? So what is it that makes poverty a juggle, right? It is that, or a time constraint, for example, for all of us, right? It is that my expenditure that I have and the incomes that I have don't necessarily match, right? Incomes are uncertain. So, the bulk of people in the developing world, for instance, they rely on agriculture. Sometimes it's a good crop, sometimes it's a bad crop, and things are so much beyond your control, right? But school fees have to be paid on time, other expenses, or somebody has a medical emergency. So there is this misalignment between your expenditure flows and your income flows. And to begin with, as a poor person, you have very low incomes, and then the uncertainty adds another layer, quite an important layer of stress, financial stress, right? In the equivalent of that for poor people in a developed country, for instance, that in a gig economy, you don't have a regular job, right? Sometimes there are many Uber rides and you're able to get more money, and other days there is nothing, right? Or because you asked about seasonality in the context of a developing country, almost in every culture there is a word for the lean season. It's like right before harvest, people don't have money, like we were talking about in my example, but there is this mismatch, right? And then so some of the work that I have done in one of my recent papers is sort of looking at the standard design of cash transfer programs, for instance, right? And 97% of low and middle income countries have cash transfer programs, some conditional, some unconditional. But the standard design for most of them is you get small monthly transfers, right? Now, when we think about seasonality, now, of course, there are reasons why they give small monthly transfers. You think that somebody in subsistence, you want them to have like a minimum amount of money, right? But on the flip side, however, when there are these very big seasonal differences in the challenges you face, so in a lean season, you're really down to the wire and there aren't that many employment opportunities, if the cash transfer could come at that time, it would make a much bigger difference than if you give me the sort of small amounts of money, which I'm also getting at harvest when I have a lot more money. right? And so thinking about these things in the design would be saying that in aggregate, we don't have to pay more to people. You could keep the total amount the same, but if you could find a way to adapt it to people's needs. Now, seasonality is sort of one kind of basic adaptation, right? Because it's easier for governments to do without needing too much administrative adjustment, tailoring it to individual people's needs, right? So seasonality is one simple way to align it better to people's needs. So that was where that was coming from. And ironically, I didn't know about it before. I actually read about it in a New York Times article that somebody in the US had started this private company. It was originally called Even. And they said on their website explicitly that they read our paper and decided to start the firm. But it was an app which basically used people's history of their expenditures and incomes, individual level, and then tried to tailor your income flow, right, using the app to when you needed the money more, right? And that it will also help you then save and basically plan your finances better. And then they have, since starting the app, they now partner with companies. The name of the company has changed. It's something different now. But then they partner with companies to release people's salaries, according to the individual ebbs and flows of their expenditure and have a better match of it. And sort of this recommendation for the cash transfer programs that I am making is again this attempt to align the expenditures and the incomes. It's a different kind of alignment problem, but yes, it's trying to align them better as a way to reduce the financial stresses that people face. And in fact, one of my co-authors on the project has been doing a massive universal basic income study in Kenya. It's a long-term project. And one of the things that they are finding there, which we also found in our study, because before we decided how to tailor the cash transfers, we actually went out and asked people that if you could choose when you would get this fixed amount of money, how it would be distributed across different times of the year, how would you like it, right? So we asked people. And one of the big things that we learned in doing that was people didn't want these little drip amounts. They wanted lumpier amounts because they found it hard to save. And they didn't have good financial instruments, or they didn't have enough self-control, in terms of how they would spend it right when they got the money, because there's always something that is needing to be attended to, or they felt like a splurge. We all do sometimes, right? And all of that. So both in the private and the public sector, just thinking about aligning expenditures to incomes can go a long way in terms of helping people manage their finances better, and then all these psychological effects that we've been talking about. In the UBI study, so what they found was that they were giving these monthly amounts, month by month, and they've been doing it, and the study is ongoing. But because it's a long-term study to look at the impacts of universal basic income, they find that people basically try to take these monthly amounts and then put it into what's called a ROSCA, these rotating savings and credit associations, because what those end up doing is that then you get a lumpy amount, right, when it's your turn in the ROSCA. So people want lumpier amounts because of these behavioral constraints, because of the challenges of saving, because there are not good enough financial instruments in many developing countries. And so thinking about giving lumpier cash transfers could, especially aligned with, in the lean season, could really help a lot.
So one of the major areas of research you focus on is the intersection of gender with the types of choice dynamics and the causality between poverty and choice. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the impact that poverty has specifically on women and how that might differ from other groups.
Yeah. So I think and I think this is true in much of the developing world, to a lesser extent perhaps in the developed world, but there is always an additional layer when you are women. And I think that can come about in a bunch of ways. for example, in the context of even developed countries, and this is equally true in developing countries, somebody like Melinda French, for instance, has talked about time scarcity. And I think that, on top of the financial scarcity, this is a dimension that women also face. And to the extent that, we all know from personal experience that time scarcity creates the same kind of, mental bandwidth issues. So in that sense, for women, it's kind of like I should call it a triple whammy, because poverty itself is, in my book, a double whammy. It's a double whammy because you have less money, but then you also have less mental bandwidth because you have less money, right? And then when it comes to women, you have less money and you have all the sort of the mental burden of that. And then on top of that, you also have a time constraint. So I think it really increases the complexity of the juggle that women face to a significant extent, purely thinking in terms of the cognitive dimension. But in a bunch of my work, I have also looked at sort of what I call sort of non-cognitive dimension. So it's not just about making decisions and, allocating your time, but there is also the question of identity. And, what do I mean by that? I think the narrative that we have about ourselves and that is fed to women about them because of social norms and what the expectations are and what are things that are okay or appropriate for women to do versus not do. I think this weakens their bargaining power or bargaining position in starting from the household, starting from within the household, right from the time that they are born, and through marriage and through the labor market, and so it has all these ramifications. And so on top of the cognitive dimension, these narratives about ourselves also create a lot of barriers. It creates barriers in terms of what we think we are entitled to, as women. If there are barriers, for example, in terms of you have to defer to the husband, or you have to somehow put yourself last in terms of the resources you get right from what you can eat, within the household. There's a lot of evidence, for instance, which shows that when women children fall sick, they don't get the same resources as male children, for instance, right? And so I think that from a very early age, from birth, your expectation of what you are allowed or what is you're entitled to changes. And when we have a different narrative about that, it constrains the choices that you make. And I think that the work that I have done in this space is of two kinds. It's sort of trying to look at taking a population which faces a lot of stigma on top of being poor. So this is, we looked at sex workers in India, and the intervention that we did was exactly about these narratives, and trying to change their self-narrative in a more positive way. And what we saw, not just, this was an 8-week program, an intervention that we did, where we tried to say, well, you're already people call them much worse names than sex workers. So, how do you compare yourself to a thief is a question that we asked them at the beginning of the program, right? And, clearly, if at the end of the day they can tell themselves honestly that they make an honest living, right, even if it's not a profession that everybody would approve of, and when you put it in terms of a thief, they see themselves in a more positive light, and then we talk to them about all the other things, about whether it's savings, anything else. And what we find is that changing their self-narrative in this way and trying to overcome the burden of these sort of negative social norms and stereotypes about what women are entitled to, we find that it changes not just their savings behavior, they save more for themselves. It also changes their preventive health behavior, which is that they do physical health checkups much more regularly. And we know that not from our asking them, but from administrative records data. So, there isn't a sort of a reporting bias in these things. And so, there is this sort of, the literature we were drawing on here is this work in psychology which talks about self-affirmation, right? And this idea that people have to have a narrative of being morally good and also competent. And until they have like a basic level of assurance that they meet a certain threshold, they don't feel very motivated to put in the effort to even improve their own lives. And we found that not just, in the 8 weeks of the program, but like 20, 21 months after the program. So I think that sort of in thinking in terms of the gender dimension, these narratives people have, and knowing what those are, some of the narratives we have are sort of imposed on us from society. And once those narratives have been imposed, then even when we get new data, which might contradict that, we are less likely to see it because we have bought into a narrative for so long. It's quite hard for us to get out of that. And the last piece I want to say in that context is that when we think about these non-cognitive dimensions that hold people back, because a lot of times poor people, and not only women, right, but it can be because of ethnicity, race, and on the other things, there's a lot of social negative stereotypes about communities, like it's another heuristic, it's a mental shortcut that people develop, right, for reasons which are sometimes sort of rational based on data, but sometimes not, right? But there is the burden of all these negative stereotypes that people who are poor have to overcome. And sometimes they do internalize those narratives, right, because you've heard it so often. And so it takes more than material resources. Just saying that, hey, there are these educational programs doesn't make them choose that because their self-narrative is not positive enough. So I think in those dimensions, we need to think about that, when we put out the programs. This is another aspect of program design. And I think here, in both the sex workers study, but also other work I have done in India, leveraging the power of the group, the collective, is something really important and valuable to help counter these negative stereotypes. We can't always change the way society thinks about, if we expect society to change, that's harder. But for the person, also it's hard if all the time people around you, are feeding back this negative stereotype. And that's why we have to help them as a collective. So in the sex workers case, for instance, we didn't do this as individual interventions. We did this as a group. And we reminded them of how, when they got together as a group and, for instance, started a cooperative savings bank because private banks didn't want their money, right? How it helped them sort of empower their own lives. And so I think that collective aspect becomes important when people who are poor or marginalized have to deal with negative narratives, either imposed by society and oftentimes internalized.
So your work focuses a lot on poverty, obviously, as we've discussed throughout the episode, but we're living in what people have called an attention economy, where attention is increasingly a scarce resource.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk to the implications that you think your research has as attention becomes more and more scarce, and the impact potentially on people's decision making and broader society.
Yeah. So, when we talk about poverty, right, and I'll bring it to attention in a second, right, we are talking in terms of people's attention. I have alluded to, for instance, people's beliefs and narratives, but there's also a bunch of literature which talks about mental health. And how being in poverty systematically worsens people's mental health. And that's why interventions, including some that some of our colleagues have done, which are specifically about therapies to improve mental health, does, improve the choices that people who are poor make. And I think that, speaking about the larger attention economy, 10 years ago, or even less than that, I've been at the school about 10 years now, but when I came, I don't think we were talking so much about mental health in society as we are now. It's a very striking and stark difference, I notice. And I think some of it is for the good. But I think that some of it is possibly also that something has shifted structurally in society. I think it's a sort of open and ongoing question. How much of it is because of social media? How much of it is because of other forces? And the fact that we have these devices, which, as you know, I'm thinking of. We all know what I'm talking about when I say that. But how they are very powerful and useful tools in many ways and make our lives more efficient. But I think that it's fair to say that everybody feels personally that it comes at a cost. And to the extent that the circumstances of poverty seems to have both cognitive challenges and mental health as some things which which seem to be correlated very and go together in their situation. I'm speculating, in a broader sense about to what extent the powers and the forces that be and the technological changes that have happened around us, which genuinely are, soaking up our attention, and how that is connected or causing the mental health outcomes that we are facing. I think that we are all trying to be to some extent, but we are not entirely rational. So we do have, all of us have self-control and other challenges. And I think that in some sense, the attention is now the ultimate resource, and it is being commercialized and, in a very, very big way and being leveraged because it's all about eyeballs and traffic to particular websites, because that's what sort of is equivalent to dollars. And I think that this is something that as a society, we need to we need to be much more deliberate. And all the ongoing research, I know that all these experiments are not yet very successful, but for example, putting limits on use of social media, use of even Facebook and other kind of social networking things. And there have been some studies. I think this is something that we need to deal with more systematically. And I think this is a genuinely challenging thing to do, and to study rigorously, because it is just so much all around us that being able to ring fence and be able to compare two groups of people, one who is in the mainstream world where these challenges exist, and one group which is able to completely block those things off, is so difficult to do. But I think that given the big costs that we are facing as from personal experiences and as a society as a whole, I think it's really important for us to be very deliberate, and sort of maybe build more structural supports, shall I say, to be conscious about how we allocate our attention. One last remark I want to make there, which is that people like George Lowenstein and Nick Chater, these are sort of two behavioral economists, they have talked about how when there is this big commercial benefit to be had from garnering our attention, that behavioral economics, the way we've been talking about, we've been thinking about lack of self-control and lack of willpower and all of these things which put a lot of burden on the individual. But I think that when we are up against big commercial interests, the argument that they have made is that it's quite difficult for an individual to exercise the same kind of restraint if somebody has a lot of money, by figuring out all the ways in which they can grab your attention. So that's where I think we need to think about structural solutions as much or more maybe than just focusing on the individuals and saying it's a lack of individual willpower or self-restraint. Yeah. So this is something important in the context of the attention economy.
Thank you so much, Anandi, for the conversation. You've given a wonderful and very interesting overview of the impact of poverty on cognitive function and how that expands to decision-making, policy design, and also the attention economy. So we're really grateful for your time and for sharing all of your insights.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of the Oxford Policy Pod. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next episode.